that, and now we're ready to start. In our near the end, there might be like 3 chapters left, and this particular chapter is entitled Leaving California. In February of 1908, Elder Haskell was elected president of the California Conference. The work in the West was rapidly expanding and required a steady leader of wide experience. Since Elder Haskell had served in that capacity in former years, he would qualify and more than meet every requirement. Trembling at the thought of the responsibility laid upon his shoulders, he said in his acceptance speech, "You run a big risk in getting me in as president of this conference. I have to keep my mind on Christ, for if I looked on the billows, I should soon sink, as did Peter. But with your prayers and the grace of God, we will try to do the best we can." He and his wife spent much time in the field visiting churches and companies of believers. Hetty conducted some of the Bible classes and taught methods of personal evangelism and house to house visitation. Her husband dwelt mostly on Bible fundamentals, such as the three angels' messages of Revelation 14 and the rediscovery of truths lost sight of by the church during the Dark Ages. During the first year of Haskell's administration, the subject of Christian education received much attention from the leaders. They had long regretted the cramped quarters of the college situated in the town of Healdsburg. In June of 1908, the California Conference Committee voted to sell the school and re-establish it in a more rural area with sufficient land to make possible the carrying out of certain instructions that had come to them through the Spirit of Prophecy writings. A tract of land known as Buena Vista was selected nearby and only a few miles from Sonoma. Arrangements for its purchase were nearly complete when it was discovered that a clear title to the property could not be secured. Rapid action was needed. Healdsburg College had already been closed for a year. It seemed that delay in reopening the school would be disastrous. Elder Haskell wrote at the time, quote, "We have got our feet on the brink of Jordan, but the Jordan is not divided. The waters are not withheld." However, end quote, however, he was neither impatient nor anxious. "You have said that if we did not get that property, it is because God had a better place for us, and I believe it," he said. His brethren were of the same mind, and the search for a suitable location continued. Before long, they discovered a suitable property for sale on the summit of Howell Mountain, about a 5-mile climb from the St. Helena Sanitarium. Mr. Angwin, the owner of a popular summer resort, was retiring and placing his entire estate on the market. After several attempts at selling, he offered it at a surprisingly low figure. A survey and evaluation of the property revealed that it contained about 1,700 acres, with nearly 100 acres of good farmland, much of it level. There were 10 buildings on the estate, including a 3-story hotel and 6 cottages. The hotel dining room accommodated about 150 people. The large dance hall could, with a little renovation, be used as a chapel. 20 acres were in fruits of various kinds and 30 acres in alfalfa. During the dry season, the farmlands were well watered from 3 large springs containing 300,000 gallons of water daily. The water was raised by hydraulic rams and supplied to all the buildings. Barns were piled high with hay and grain. Horses and cows occupied the stalls and pens. Shops were filled with tools, farm implements, and wagons and carriages. 45 tons of prunes had been gathered that year, and more were on the trees. 2,000 quarts of canned fruit stood on shelves. Oh my, Winnie, we've been canning this summer, but not 2,000 quarts of canned fruit that stood on the shelves lining the cellar walls. A heavy forest covered the surrounding hills and valleys from which timber could be milled for any additional building that might be required in the future. The current buildings were in good repair, waiting only to be readied for occupancy by students and teachers. The hindrance in securing the Buena Vista property that had caused perplexity was now seen to be a reason for rejoicing. It was obvious that the Howell Mountain property was far superior. Besides, it was situated near the sanitarium where its students could receive instruction in medical missionary service from physicians and nurses. About a month from the day the papers were signed for the purchase of the property, all was in readiness. Pacific Union College, the successor of old Healdsburg College, opened its doors in time for a full term of school. There had been no time for publishing a school calendar, but about 50 students were present on opening day. During the summer months, Elder and Mrs. Haskell spent much time at camp meetings, then assisted with workers' institutes, which frequently followed them. Mrs. Haskell's letters, written during the summer of 1908, reveal some rather unusual doings. From the Eureka campground, she wrote, "There were no meetings in the camp Wednesday forenoon. About everyone went out canvassing. For most all of them, it was their first effort. Old grandmothers and little children went with the others. We had a workers' meeting Wednesday evening to report progress, and it would have done your soul good to have heard them. They hardly looked like the same people. There was victory in every testimony. If you're like some people I know, including me, you might be a little shy going door to door, knocking and talking to people you've never met before. But with God there, it's fun and it's a blessing. And you never know. Of course, you might meet hostile people on the other side of the door, but many times God has a plan in what you're doing and in what you're sharing. We, in Old Paths, you might know, we're using as the youth story a book of these experiences of colporteurs and what they write, and it's really, you can see God working in the literature work. So this is, I'm sure they were blessed. It looks like, it sounds like they were, but going on. Tuesday morning, at the close of Elder Haskell's Bible study, he offered early writings for sale, and some of the children wanted them and not have the money. Wanted them, but did not have the money. Sister King, the California Conference Sabbath School secretary, encouraged the children to sell papers and earn money to buy early writings and Great Controversy for their own. Camp meetings were so much a part of life in those days that Mrs. Haskell wrote little about them. Her description of one she attended in 1910 at Visalia, California, may be of interest here. Quote, "The camp meeting opened Thursday night, September 29. Our Sabbath school secretary came to me on Friday morning and said she did not think she would need more than one tent for the children's meetings, so there seemed to be so few children on the ground. I told her to wait till about 11 o'clock, and she would see them coming in, and sure enough, about 11 o'clock teams began to come in from the surrounding country. Surreys, carriages, and wagons filled with people began rolling into camp, and in the afternoon big covered wagons, all covered with dust, having been on the road for 2 or 3 days, came into camp. Some of our brethren drove their big cook wagons that they used to cook for the men in the hayfields, so that they had their kitchens nicely fitted up, and had their spring beds, rocking chairs, etc., and were very comfortable. Some of these big wagons contained many children, so there were plenty of children for the children's meetings. There was a creek running through the ground with large shade trees along the bank on either side, and a number of our brethren camped there. There must have been about 80 family tents on the ground, and all were occupied. Besides these and those who camped in their wagons, quite a number had rooms in hotels and private houses near the camp. This is the 11th camp meeting we have held since Elder Haskell has been president of the conference. In the early morning meetings, Elder Haskell gave Bible studies on the Spirit of the Lord, and it seemed as if every man, woman, and child on the ground was present for the meetings. On Tuesday afternoon, at the close of the afternoon meeting, a sufficient number from the camp went out to work, and in about 1 hour the whole town was covered, and the temperance instructor placed in each home in the town. In winter, invitations to local meetings such as this often appeared in the Pacific Union Recorder. Brethren, come aside from your busy cares for a few days and study God's Word, and the Lord will reward you by blessing your own souls and making you a blessing to others. One such meeting was afterward reported. The Workers' Institute held at the Lodi English Church from November 5 to 14 was a profitable season. Mrs. White, her son W.C. White, B.E. Beddoe, J.N. Loughborough, and S.G. White were named as the speakers. Elder and Mrs. Haskell also took leading parts. A 6 weeks Bible worker and colporteur training course was held at Lodi the autumn of 1910. The elder extended a special invitation through the recorder to those past middle age. For the encouragement of older members, he recounted the story of our pioneer missionary to China, Abram LaRue, who took his training for missionary service after he was 60 years old. Throughout his entire term of conference administration, Elder Haskell heartily supported the development of the medical college at Loma Linda, a work that was close to his heart. From time to time, he was on campus leading in missionary activity. Nursing students were early initiated into the newborn fundraising campaign, now known as Ingathering, for welfare and missions. For 3 days, formal classes were dismissed, and student nurses joined the crusade. In that first effort, 1908, they distributed 1,200 copies of the Thanksgiving special of the Review and received a little over $400 in offerings. The nurses felt that those 3 days' time were well spent. They had invited people to visit the sanitarium. As a result, each Sunday for several weeks thereafter, the dining room was crowded with visitors. The mayor of Los Angeles was among the guests. He remarked that it was such a rest to come to this Christian home, away from the graft of city public life. Pardon me. One young nurse, inexperienced in this type of work, called at a home where a man was painting. When she presented the paper, he very coldly turned her down. As she started to enter the next house, he called out that it was useless for her to go there. That was his home. No one would be inside but his wife, and she would not be interested in the paper. The girl first turned away, but something impelled her to go back and knock. As the door opened, she saw a woman holding a baby. Suddenly, as she watched, the child went into convulsions. The mother thought her baby was dying. The nurse noticed a boiler of water heating on the stove. She asked that a wash tub, and soon had the child in a hot bath. The young mother had called her husband, and together they watched the nurse apparently bring the baby back to life. Overjoyed, they were now ready to hear about the needs of missions and to make a liberal gift. Elder Haskell called the attention of his fellow workers in the California Conference to a privilege they might enjoy of working in a foreign mission field at home. He was referring to the spiritual needs of the Orientals living in the Bay cities of San Francisco and Oakland. In the recorder, he wrote, "It is not enough for us to drop a quarter on the plate for the work in China and Japan, and do nothing for the people from those countries in our own land. We expect to pay large sums to carry the work in Japan, and it is right that we should. But is it not equally as important to carry the message to the Japanese in Oakland? Above all else, we wish that you would pray for the little taper light that has been kindled for the heathen Japanese within our own borders." Also in the recorder, Mrs. Eliza Swift described a school she was conducting for Japanese students in Oakland. Opened Opening on May 15, 1908, 30 students were enrolled. They had Bible lessons every Friday evening, the average attendance being from 3 to 5, but increasing to 8 or 9. Among the students were young men of talent and ability, graduates of the Waseda and Imperial colleges of Japan, who came to learn the English language. She opened a Sunday school November 15 and was greatly encouraged as they showed an earnest desire to learn the Bible. The school was held in a rented cottage, the expenses being met partly by tuition, but largely by contribution. She thanked friends who had sent Bibles because the leaves were falling out of the ones they had. She reported that it was much harder to present the truth to them than to English speaking people, yet many seeds of truth had been sown and some had taken root. A later report bore witness that some seeds did bear fruit. 3 young men accepted the Adventist truth and at the 1910 camp meeting held meetings in their own language with good success. Work had also been done in the past for Koreans in Sacramento, resulting in the conversion of a small company. three of whom attended Healdsburg College. While rejoicing over the work being done, Elder Haskell mourned that there were no schools for the Chinese similar to the one Mrs. Swift was conducting for the Japanese. But he was able to report on the beginning of work among the Chinese people. At the close of the Oakland Institute in the spring of 1910, G. A. Coons and his wife began distributing literature in the Sunset District of San Francisco. J. A. Stevens and brother R. S. Fries joined them. As a result of this work, on December 31, 1910, a church of 22 members was organized called the Park Seventh-day Adventist Church. Haskell also reported that a ship missionary named Peters was distributing thousands of pages of literature among the officers and sailors of ships in San Francisco Bay and placing bound books in their libraries. These books had been purchased by Seventh-day Adventists attending the camp meetings and donated to him for ship mission work. And so the search for those willing to obey all of God's commandments continued prayerfully, perseveringly, and patiently. The 40th session of the California Conference was held from February 9 to 19, 1911 in Fresno, California, with 208 delegates. Friday, the second day of the conference, was observed as a day of fasting and prayer. At this session, Elder Haskell retired from his position as conference president. Now, in his 79th year, he was weary and felt that the time had come for him to place his heavy administrative duties and responsibilities on younger shoulders. Yet he closed his 3 years of presidency by presiding at all of its 15 business sessions and by taking an active part in deliberations. Those 3 years had been a period of rapid growth and steady advancement in California. Temperance and religious liberty work were being vigorously promoted. Church schools were multiplying. The St. Helena Sanitarium was staffed with consecrated nurses working wholeheartedly with Christian physicians and chaplains endeavoring to bring both physical and spiritual healing to their patients. 26 new churches had been organized in the conference. This advance was not due to abundant ministerial help, but quite largely to the diligence of church members in scattering gospel literature and in holding Bible studies in private homes. A unanimous expression of appreciation was given the veteran administrator and his wife. The weary warriors took no glory to themselves, but as they bade farewell to their California brethren, they expressed deep gratitude for the cooperation of their fellow workers and for self-sacrificing, active church members who had so diligently sown the gospel seed. The Haskells returned to Tennessee. But I'm sure they stayed busy where they went, because the next chapter is called The Temperance Campaign. Let's see what it says. Hasten on to Maine. Haskell held in his hand a letter from Mrs. White that had come in the morning mail. I wonder why. Why the need of special haste? Hetty inquired. They had already left Nashville and were at South Lancaster on their way to Portland, Maine. with the intent of opening a mission in the city. Her husband finished reading the letter. No reason given, probably because she didn't know the reason. Bless her heart. We'll find out when we get there. In Portland, they were more mystified than ever. No special project demanded immediate attention. No preparations had been made for the opening of the mission. Interest seemed to be centered in the coming 1911 camp meeting at Norridgewock, and Haskell's assistance was not particularly needed with that. So, not knowing just where to begin or what to do, Elder Haskell began making the acquaintance of some of the businessmen in town. His wife occupied her time visiting from door to door, distributing literature and making friends. They continued to wonder why they had been urged by Mrs. White to hasten to Portland. But as they mingled with the townsfolk, they learned that a fierce battle was being waged between the Wets, WETS, and the Dries. Temperance lecturers who had come to Maine from all parts of the country were holding statewide rallies, working desperately in a last-minute effort to educate the populace in temperance principles, hoping that on election day they would cast their ballot on the right side of the question. The general opinion, as the Haskells heard it expressed, was that the temperance cause would probably lose the battle. Haskell talked with the leading brethren, presenting to them their responsibility in cooperating with the temperance forces and helping to save the state from the degradation of liquor. For many years, Maine had stood almost alone for the temperance cause. The men listened apathetically, so he thought, then asked, why engage in this side issue? Is not the proclamation of the last day message our great objective? Besides, why waste our strength fighting a losing battle? The conference president had been so fully occupied with administrative duties and with preparations for the coming camp meeting that he was scarcely aware of any temperance crisis. He called the committee together and gave Haskell an opportunity to present a plan of action. Haskell had brought a copy of the Temperance Special Youth's Instructor of March 7. Holding the paper out before them, he said, this year's temperance instructor is, to my thinking, the very best weapon we could use in fighting the liquor demon. No right-minded person could read it without being influenced in favor of temperance. Let us get a copy of this excellent paper into every home in the city. Let us scatter it throughout the state. Let every Seventh day Adventist rise as one man and join in the battle. Whether we win or lose, we shall at least show the world where Seventh day Adventists stand. There is little time before the election. Even if the instructors are ordered immediately and leave the office promptly, we will still have only 4 or 5 weeks in which to cover the state. His call for immediate action was met with the inevitable question, where can we find the money? Everyone agreed that the elder's plan was excellent, but before he had time to say any more, another question was raised. Who will distribute these thousands and thousands of instructors? Will work with the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the other temperance forces, he replied, but they have And then someone else said, but they have turned down our literature because it is published by Seventh-day Adventists, the people who oppose the Sunday closing bill, was an answer. The committee members separated without definite action, knowing that delay would mean defeat, and still undaunted, Haskell went home and at once ordered an immediate shipment of 12,000 temperance instructors. He promised to assume full responsibility for the cost. The papers were sent with 11,000 charged 11,000 charged to the main conference. 1,000 were a contribution to from the review. Not waiting for the instructors to arrive, Mrs. Haskell donned her white ribbon, the badge of membership, and called on the WCTU president, Mrs. Stevens. She was kindly received, and Mrs. Stevens entered enthusiastically into the plan of distributing the instructors. She also used her influence in securing the use of the YWCA rooms for storage and as a distribution center for the large pile of 12,000 copies. As soon as the papers came, all hands took hold with a will, offering the instructor to each family in the city. Adventist workers were called from other states to help organize the campaign. Elder Haskell went in one direction and Mrs. Haskell in another. Elder George B. Starr and his wife found many ministers of large congregations who were glad to use the special issue of the paper. One minister asked for 3,000 copies and arranged for the young men of his congregation to distribute them. Others handed them to members at the door as they left the church. Elder Piper, the conference president, called on the chairman of the Prohibition Committee, who presented the instructor at a mass meeting. As a result, 10,000 copies were requested, twice as many as could be spared just then from the rapidly diminishing supply. As the campaign extended from town to town, more papers were needed. When an order for 23,000 was sent in, pardon me, just a moment. It's getting so interesting, I can't stop reading. When an order for, pardon me, for 23,000 was sent in, it ran the account at the review office up to $2,000. In other words, they owed $2,000. A prompt response hummed over the wire. They would forward the shipment only if Haskell would take personal responsibility for its payment. This was a fearful liability for a poor man to assume, and no one was willing to share the risk with him. Yet, if the campaign should lag at this point, all would be lost. More than this, he had in his pocket a telegram just received from Mrs. White. It said, "Push the temperance campaign." What should he do? He knew that such directions were stamped with a higher authority than that of Ellen White. He wired the office, "Send the papers. I will beg until they are paid for." His wife remonstrated, "Stephen, you can never pay $2,000. How do you know whether the people will respond?" Remember, Brother Rivas said at the Review and Herald office in Washington that the money was coming in slowly. This could mean selling the shelter over your head to pay that amount, and you are too old to be left homeless. And Mrs. Haskell was saying, "You're too old to be left homeless." He replied with his usual decision, I would rather lose every penny I own in this world than fail to do as the Lord directs. So the campaign continued on in its intensity. Not even the camp meeting was permitted to interrupt its operations. Wrote Haskell, I do not think the brethren in Maine have been so stirred before, especially in these late years. They came up to the camp meeting full of courage and hope, for they began to see that they could actually do something. They were discouraged because of past failures, but all they needed was to be set to work and shown how to do it. During the week, they distributed 14,000 instructors from the campground. Some days there were 2 or 3 companies out. The WCTU, in other words, the Women's Something Another Temperance Union, laid their own literature aside and distributed in all over 10,000 instructors. 2 temperance rallies were held on the campground with good effect. As public attention focused increasingly on the misery caused by intoxicating liquor, public sentiment seemed to grow in favor of strict temperance, and the Prohibition people frequently heard the hope expressed that their side might win. It was, therefore, with disappointment that they listened to the final returns of the balloting. The liquor forces had won with a surplus of nearly 1,000 votes in the statewide election. But some in close touch with public sentiment suspected an unfair count. Oh my, doesn't that sound familiar? A court examination of the ballots was demanded. The second count reversed the returns, giving a surplus of 700 in favor of prohibition. It was discovered that town clerks in 3 towns had made their reports read in favor of license when it should have read not in favor. The general public, both enemies and friends, acknowledged that it was the temperance instructor that had won the victory. Before the end of the month, the entire instructor account was settled, oh my, and the more than 53,000 copies distributed were all paid for. The Haskells now understood why they had been urged to hasten to Portland. Had they delayed even 1 week, they would have arrived too late to accomplish the desired results. However, the battle was not ended. A few months later, Elder Haskell wrote, the temperance issue is now at a crisis here in the state. The authorities, especially in Portland, Lewiston, and some of the larger cities, are strong liquor men and are determined that they will not enforce the laws. They allow open saloons to be kept in the disreputable parts of the city and then claim that there is more liquor sold on the sly than if there were open saloons all over the city, and thus are trying to do what they can to defeat prohibition. And the governor of the state stands with them. There is a special session of the legislature called for March 20th. One reason, the governor states, for calling this session is to try and adjust this temperance question. A leading Portland newspaper that had formerly favored temperance had now reversed its policy. When Elder Haskell talked with the editor, the man declared, we are not dry, we are wet. You have not seen one line in favor of prohibition in our paper since the election, and you will not see any. We are done with it. Only one paper in the city, Evening Express, continued to favor temperance principles. Haskell laid the matter before his associates. We must not give up the fight. He thundered. The battle has been too costly and the results too far reaching for us to now abandon our cause to failure. But what shall we do? We must educate the people. He remembered a chapter in Ellen G. White's Ministry of Healing entitled The Liquor Traffic and Prohibition. With Mrs. White's approval, he wrote the review office requesting that they print 50,000 copies of that chapter in tract form, direct from the pages of the book. This they gladly did and donated the entire 50,000 to the temperance cause free of charge. Jenny Bates, Haskell's secretary, sent a sample tract to the leader of every WCTU society in Maine, asking whether they would like to use it in their localities. Requests for tracts ranging from 1 to 10,000 copies poured in from the various societies. Church members took hold of the work heartily. They spent weekends, holidays, distributing tracts at Seaside. Oh, Maine has a nice seaside. Distributing tracts at Seaside and other pleasure resorts. They visited managers of institutions, factories, and stores, and either passed out the tracts themselves or left them to be distributed by directors and superintendents. The knowledge that these were published by Seventh day Adventists did much to make friends for the Adventist cause in Maine. Before the appointed date when the temperance question was to come before the legislature, confusion entered the ranks of those promoting the proposed bill, dividing them into contending parties, and the question was not discussed at that time. In the meantime, the Haskells had not forgotten their original purpose in coming to Portland. After a few days' search, they found a pleasant apartment on the ground floor of a large house near the Adventist church. 9 days after the first temperance campaign closed, the mission opened. About 7 or 8 of the church people were willing to join the mission as helpers and to learn the art, of house to house evangelism. Most of these were older women and not otherwise employed. Among them were 1 or 2 nurses. Some had sold books. All were completely inexperienced in city evangelism. Each worker was handed a package of tracts and, after a few brief instructions, was sent out to sell or lend them to the citizens of Portland. Mrs. Haskell held 2 classes each day for the staff. The usual Bible study class came at 6 o'clock in the morning, followed by an instructional class in methods of home evangelism after breakfast. The workers spent the remainder of the day visiting and distributing literature, and the evenings in study. New helpers joined the mission family until at one time it numbered 12. Not all did the same type of work. Some sold books, some did nursing, others distributed literature and conducted Bible studies in homes. One public service was held each Sunday evening. Scores of families were reading journals and tracts lent to them for a week or longer, then gathered up by the workers and passed on to others. Some homes, ordinarily closed to religious teachers, were now gradually opening up to the kindly women who visited them and were never too hurried to lend a hand in time of sickness or trouble. 2 of the workers were past 50 years of age. One was 60 and another 65. Elder Haskell maintained that the oldest one of them all that the oldest one of them all was distributing nearly twice as much literature as any of the others. One of the elderly women, Mrs. Manter, through perseverance, was granted permission by the chief of police to set up a literature table in front of a large hotel at a busy streetcar transfer point. Above the table hung a sign printed in several languages, and it read, "Buy without money." Piles of tracts arranged according to subject and language, neatly fastened together with rubber bands, were exhibited on the table. When a passerby paused to scan one of the papers, Mrs. Manter would separate it from the others and with a gracious smile present it to him. The mission prospered. Its workers were supporting themselves largely by the sale of the journal Bible Training School. Adventist farmers supplied fruits and vegetables in abundance for the mission table. The Pacific Press contributed a club of 100 signs of the times. Mrs. White frequently sent small donations that had been given her to be applied wherever she thought best. The conference appointed Elder E. E. Osborne to help as assistant evangelist, and the Melrose Sanitarium sent a doctor and a nurse to help conduct health and cooking classes. However, in spite of the fact that many were interested in Bible study and deeply stirred, few took a definite stand. Haskell became discouraged and considered closing the mission to seek a more fruitful field of labor elsewhere. But Mrs. White wrote, urging him to continue where he was. She had hoped to revisit Portland herself. It was her childhood home. There she had first learned the message of Jesus' second coming. In that city she had begun her work. But now she was too busy at her California home. Elmshaven, writing was occupying all her time. She wrote encouragingly to the Haskells that the work they had done there was a good work, well and faithfully accomplished. It would result in much good, and Elder Haskell must not regard it as a failure. He accepted her counsel, and though occasionally called away for indefinite periods of time to meet other appointments, he remained in Portland until the middle of 1912. After moving from there to South Lancaster, Elder Haskell had his attention called to the scarcity of religious literature for the blind. Immediately he turned his attention to securing the publication of good Seventh-day Adventist books in Braille. I wonder if they're still available, Brother John, if you're listening. The first messenger of joy from the Adventist people to those experiencing the blindness was Steps to Christ. In 1914, Elder Haskell wrote Mrs. White that the book, Patriarchs and Prophets, had just been published in raised print, and he had ordered a set for her. It filled 4 large volumes and would be placed in 70 circulating libraries. The expense of publishing for the blind amounted to between $2,000 and $3,000 and was largely met by the sale of the Bible Training School. He wrote that Charles Miller, a blind Seventh-day Adventist minister, sold 2 special editions of the journal of 30,000 each in the interest of this work. In 1914, Elder Haskell's The Cross and Its Shadow was published. This book was the fruitage of long years of teaching on the subject of the sanctuary. In it, he described and explained how the entire system of offerings and ceremonies connected with the worship of ancient Israel illustrated in symbol the ministry of Christ in saving sinners and ridding the earth of sin. Christ himself was the sacrificial offering, the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world. He is also our high priest and applies his own cleansing blood to the sinner's need. He is now officiating in the sanctuary in heaven, completing his great and glorious work of making an end of sin and obliterating all traces of the curse brought to this world by disobedience. Mrs. White's secretary, Clarence C. Chrysler, was with her when she received her copy of this book, The Cross and its Shadow. In acknowledgment, Chrysler wrote, "She was much pleased over the thought of your remembering her thus with the first fruits of your long labor of love in preparing the book and in seeing it through the press. Several times when going into her office room, I have found Sister White with your book in her hand. She rejoices also that Brother and Sister Haskell are doing what they can to add to the treasure of good reading material prepared and published in pleasing form, now available for study by our young men and women. So far as I've been able to observe personally, the possession of your books has always given Sister White real pleasure, and this latest one has brought to her comfort and cheer, and is kept within easy reach, close by her own volumes to which she frequently refers. The next year, 1915, when the Haskells were again in Nashville, they received a telegram from the church in Portland, Maine, containing cheering news, which they immediately relayed to Mrs. White. Quote, "Church is free from a debt they had carried for years, interest and all paid. Sabbath was a glorious day. Church was crowded. We also raised $1,500 in pledges for missions. Faith is the victory." Yet another cheering message reached her that the work in Portland and all through the state of Maine was prospering, as she had told them it would. The two faithful workers who had followed her counsel to persevere in spite of discouragements now rejoiced that God had given them faith and patience to obey. And that's the end of that chapter. Let me just look ahead. Maybe one chapter remains, at most two. We'll finish up next week, Lord willing. Okay, I think it's time to close. So let's have prayer, shall we? Father, we do thank you. We thank you abundantly for this inspiring report of how the Haskells, in their late years, didn't stop working for you, had a great work to do in Maine, and had a plan. And people were inspired by his plan. And even though he became discouraged near the end, he's glad he stayed. And Sister White encouraged him to. So we thank you for all of that, and help us to learn too patience and to be encouraged, even though things don't look like they're prospering around us. We ask that you will bless all the seeds that we've sown here and there with literature or with the spoken word. Father, only you can bring it to fruitage. Only your spirit can change your heart. And so we ask for those that are on our hearts that you will intervene in the name of Jesus, we ask for their salvation too. And all the seeds we've sown at training our children or speaking words of comfort and encouragement, may they all be blessed. And and grow and prosper in the hearts of others, I pray. And I thank you. Be with those that, Father, that we think about tonight that may be grieving, may be in need of something that we can provide. Help us to have open eyes to those around us and open ears, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen. And till we meet again, may God bless and keep you, and may we all be faithful to Him through the coming week. Bye for now.